Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
Imagine standing centuries ago on the high plateaus of Ethiopia, where the crisp air is scented with incense from nearby monasteries, and the golden light of dawn burns gently across rugged landscapes dotted with ancient stone churches. The immensity of sky presses down, an endless canvas stretching toward lofty peaks. Here, in remote monasteries carved into basalt cliffs or perched atop hillsides verdant with juniper and cedar, scholars in saffron robes pore over worn parchments, their eyes glinting with wonder as they trace constellations unfamiliar to Western astronomy. The day dawns as usual until suddenly, all light holds still. The sun halts, motion suspended in an uncanny embrace between time and eternity. Could such an event appear in human memory, rendered in codices, oral lore, or astronomical notes? This article explores Ethiopia's hidden astronomical records of such a moment, weaving together historical context, surviving manuscripts, and the intersection of faith, science, and myth that shaped how Ethiopians have observed the heavens. Ethiopia has a rich astronomical tradition, deep-rooted in its unique calendar, ancient ecclesiastical scholarship, and indigenous wisdom. The Ethiopian calendar, closely related to the ancient Coptic system, counts 13 months, 12 of 30 days each, plus a shorter 13th month, and began in what we call AD 8 according to the Annunciation era. Its creation incorporates astute observations of the solar year, as well as intercalation to keep the seasons aligned. Monks in Axum and Zaguiera monasteries would carefully note the sunrise at equinoxes, solstices, and the unforgettable celestial spectacles, solar eclipses, comets, planetary conjunctions that fell from time to time. Within the hallowed halls of Ethiopian monastic libraries, such as those in Lake Tana's islands or Lalibela's rock-hewn sanctuaries, luminous manuscripts record more than prayers. Marginalia and Guizi scrolls whisper of tremors felt in the heavens, of days when light seemed to stand firm, of the prolonged dawn that newcomers called a miracle. Ethiopian Christianity, heavily shaped by Judaic and early Christian thought, merged natural observation with biblical imagery. The account of Joshua commanding the sun to stand still, Joshua 10 verses 12 to 13, resonated powerfully. In Ethiopian interpretation, this biblical sun stillness became not only a divine act but also a model for interpreting astronomical anomalies. Over centuries, scribes layered these biblical memories with lived observations. A marginal note in a 15th century Guizi chronicle, for example, references an uncommon stillness in the sky observed during the feast of St. Michael. Although the text is fragmentary and its meaning uncertain, scholars suggest that it could describe a partial solar eclipse so gradual that illumination dimmed imperceptibly over hours, giving the impression of suspended motion. Explanations relying on atmospheric diffusion or localized cloud cover persisted in oral tradition long after the manuscripts faded. There are tantalizing references to the 1st century of the Ethiopian kingdom, predating the rise of Christianity. These claims, though difficult to verify, suggest indigenous cosmological systems that link the celestial cycles to agricultural festivals. Oral accounts passed down through generations describe days without sequence, most likely poetic descriptions of phenomena like solar halos, anomalous refractions at high altitude, or rare but dramatic twilight effects that could last for hours. When early European travelers and Jesuit missionaries arrived in the Horn of Africa in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were offered a wealth of fascinating accounts, though they often struggled to reconcile these stories with Western astronomical frameworks. One Jesuit report from the late 1580s describes articulated Ethiopian cosmology. They deem the heavens alive, that the sun's slow descent may reflect the will of saints. In their tales, a day when the sun tarried was no accident, but a message. These travelers, fascinated, sketched their own crude diagrams of the Ethiopian calendar and noted the precision of some monastic timekeeping, using gnomons, vertical rods casting shadows, to mark the solar noon and trace the changing angle over the year. They documented how scribes meticulously recorded the shadow's length on parchment, correlating it with the date, and thus reconstructing a solar analemma over years. Perhaps the most compelling historical moment comes during the reign of Emperor Tsar Yakub, reigned 1434 to 1468. Tsar Yakub was an intellectual emperor deeply invested in theological and astronomical learning. During his reign, scholars at the royal court had access to foreign astronomical instruments, astrolabes brought by Syrian and Egyptian visitors, and were beginning to experiment with synthesis. In the mid-1440s, several court chronicles recount that Tsar Yakub asked monastic astronomers whether the sun could be halted for prayer. While there is no explicit record of an actual astronomical anomaly, the king's fascination and records suggesting that weekly midday prayers were accompanied by special solar notations reflect theoretical musings grounded in the glory of the heavens. Whether these entries refer to a metaphorical sun standing still or a real observed event is debated, yet the intellectual milieu they evoke is vivid. Moving forward to the 19th century, we find more verifiable astronomical data. Missionaries and explorers such as James Bruce, who visited Ethiopia in the 1770s, wrote in detail about the Ethiopian calendar and local astronomical calculation. While Bruce's descriptions focus more on calendrical correction and holiday alignment than on rare solar phenomena, they underscore Ethiopia's long-held engagement with observational timekeeping. Later, explorers with telescopes recorded an annular solar eclipse, where locals purportedly described the slow fading of daylight as the moon crept across the sun, an effect likened to the sun pausing in grief. No surviving Ethiopian account matches Bruce's outward style, but oral traditions on the slopes of Simien Mountains continue to speak of a white sun that lingered during an eclipse their ancestors witnessed, even if the specific date is lost to time. To appreciate these records, we should also consider the broader cultural and theological context. In Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, time is sacred. The year begins with Mescharim around September and culminates in Jena Ethiopian Christmas, marked by celebrations timed by observations of the solar position relative to Haile Selassie's sunstone in Addis Ababa, used in modern times as an extension of earlier traditions. Starlight and sunlight guide fasts, feasts, and pilgrimages. A momentary stagnation of the sun, whether perceived, mythologized, or actual, would naturally be woven into liturgical memory. Crucially, we must examine the possibility that what was perceived in Ethiopian memory as the sun standing still might correspond to well-known celestial mechanics. The biblical Joshua story is itself widely thought to be a poetic retelling of a long sunset or twilight prolongation, perhaps caused by atmospheric refraction. In Ethiopia's high elevations and arid plateaus, similar refractions are standard, where the sun seems to flatten, linger longer at the horizon, or blaze with supernatural intensity. Coupled with ritual significance, such optical effects could readily enter ecclesiastical register as holy stillness. Modern historians and archaeoastronomers, Ethiopian and international, have begun to analyze these claims. Using computer reconstructions of past skies, they have identified dates when solar eclipses or atmospheric twilight effects would have been especially pronounced over central Ethiopian highlands. For example, a partial eclipse in 1608, May 10th, would have crossed northern regions under clear skies. At high altitude, this eclipse could appear as a slow, deliberate passage, echoing the metaphorical sun standing still. Another significant eclipse in 1624 exhibited unusually long partial phases in parts of the Horn of Africa, and local traditions refer to an afternoon without change, perhaps pointing to this specific celestial spectacle. Yet the real hidden records are not always in printed manuscripts. Many survive as oral traditions in remote churches, like those of Abba Penelwan on the islands of Lake Tana, or in rural Tigray villages, where priests recite ancestral tales of unusual days, hours that felt suspended, times when prayer and sky were locked in resonance. Folklorists have worked with these elders to collect narratives that speak less of dates and more of meaning, the sun that delayed prayer, the shade that held back night. These are deeply evocative phrases, and though they evade precise astronomical labeling, they affirm that communities experienced and acknowledged such moments. What can modern scholars learn from these layered records? First, that astronomical observation in Ethiopia has always been intertwined with spiritual interpretation. The day the sun stood still may never map to a discrete date in our Gregorian charts. If it did, it might align with a long eclipse or prolonged twilight, but the perception of stillness belongs more to lived experience. Still, the documentation, scarred by time yet luminous with intention, reminds us of Ethiopia's long tradition of skywatching, calculation, theology, and oral memory. Furthermore, studying these accounts invites us to reconsider how pre-modern societies perceive time and nature not as neutral backdrops, but as animate realms. In Ethiopia, the cosmos is not the distant domain of impersonal forces, but a stage for divine conversation. A stiffened sun becomes emblematic, a sign, a message, a reflection of deeper meaning. Our modern scientific expectations ask for measurement, precision, timestamps. Ethiopian memory teaches us that meaning is also made through narrative, ritual, and repetition. When we think of hidden astronomical records, we often assume dusty observatories or archaic star charts. But Ethiopia's archives do not always present like charts. They emerge in the hush of chanting monks, in the curve of marginal Guizi script, in centuries-old hymns that speak of the lasting light. To reconstruct them, scholars must tread softly, combining archaeoastronomy with philology, theology with atmospheric physics, archaeology with oral history. In recent decades, Ethiopian universities and research collaboration with European archaeoastronomers have begun fieldwork, audio recording traditions, dating manuscripts, and running simulations of historical skies. They map when eclipses or twilight anomalies would have been visible in regions like Amhara, Oromia, and Tigray, aligning them with monastic feast calendars. Though the work is ongoing, preliminary conferences in Addis Ababa circa 2022 have showcased cases where prayer calendars shift subtly after eclipses, perhaps preserving memory of a day when the sky conspired to stretch daylight and faith responded in awe. In conclusion, while Ethiopia has no singular, datable day the sun stood still in modern astronomical registry, it holds a treasury of memory, manuscript marginalia, oral tales, and calendar observances that speak of days when time seemed to bend. These records lie hidden between lines, between chants, between dusk and dawn. They remind us that human beings everywhere have seen something in the sky worth telling again, in tones trembling between wonder and devotion. As we peer into these traditions today, we do not simply reconstruct the path of the sun, we rekindle the way ancestors felt it.